In an empire ruled by a cruel and arrogant businessman, a cleaning lady unexpectedly brings her quiet daughter to work. The girl's curiosity about a mysterious manuscript reveals an extraordinary linguistic talent that challenges even the company's owner. What began as mere provocation becomes a clash of worlds, and a forgotten truth threatens to shatter centuries of arrogance. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching from. Continuing. The elevator rose silently through the 40 floors of the glass and steel skyscraper that dominated the Manhattan skyline. Inside, Sarah Miller held tightly to the hand of her 12-year-old daughter, Sophie, as she watched the digital numbers change on the panel. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from the chill of the air conditioning, but from the anxiety tightening her chest. "Mom, why am I here with you today?" Sophie asked for the third time, adjusting her school backpack. On her shoulders, her brown eyes sparkled with curiosity as she observed the luxurious interior of the elevator, with its mirrored walls and gold-plated buttons. "I already told you, honey. Your grandmother had to go to the hospital for some tests and couldn't pick you up from school today. There was no one else." Sarah sighed, smoothing the blue uniform she had worn for 5 years. "You're going to stay very quiet while I work, all right? You mustn't disturb anyone." Sophie nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. In the 12 years of her life, she had never stepped foot in such an imposing building. The stories her mother told about her work always seemed exaggerated. How could a place exist that was so different from their small apartment in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn? The doors opened on the 38th floor, revealing a white marble hallway that stretched out like a frozen river. Sarah walked quickly, her shoes echoing against the polished floor, while Sophie followed a few steps behind, fascinated by the paintings on the walls and the exotic plants decorating the space. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller," greeted the receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair. Her eyes fixed on Sophie, with an expression of poorly disguised disapproval. "Mr. Sterling doesn't usually allow visitors during office hours." "I know, but it was an emergency. She'll stay with me and won't get in the way of anything, I promise." Sarah's voice carried a tone of supplication that Sophie had never heard before. Richard Sterling, at 45, was the kind of man who made sure to be noticed even when he was alone. His office occupied the entire top floor of the building, with panoramic windows offering a privileged view of the city. The walls were decorated with artworks that cost more than Sarah earned in a lifetime, and a mahogany bookshelf housed books in dozens of different languages. But what drew the most attention was the object resting on a glass table in the center of the room, an ancient manuscript, its pages yellowed by time, and written in characters that seemed to dance across the surface of the parchment. Richard had bought it at an auction in London 2 years prior, more as a symbol of his intellectual status than out of any genuine interest in its content. Sitting in his Italian wheelchair made of carbon fiber and equipped with the most modern technological accessories, Richard was reviewing financial reports when Sarah knocked discreetly on the door. "Come in," he said, without looking up from the documents. His voice had that sharp tone Sarah knew well, the same tone he used when he was about to find faults in her work. Sarah pushed the door open slowly, revealing Sophie at her side. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Richard looked up from the papers, and his expression changed from indifference to irritation in a matter of seconds. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice had the power to make people shrink, and Sarah felt her shoulders hunch automatically. "Mr. Sterling, I apologize. My mother had to go to the hospital, and I had no way to leave Sophie at home. It's just for today. She won't be a bother at all." Richard studied the girl with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a doubtful investment. Sophie, unlike her mother, showed no signs of intimidation. Her eyes roamed the office with genuine admiration, stopping especially on the manuscript upon the glass table. "How old is she?" Richard asked, still watching Sophie. 12, sir." "And why isn't she in school?" "She was at school, but she was let out early today because of a teachers' meeting," Sarah replied quickly, wringing her hands. Richard paused, savoring the discomfort of the situation. There was something about exercising power over people in vulnerable positions that always gave him pleasure. It was a constant reminder of his own superiority, especially after the accident that had left him confined to a wheelchair 5 years ago. "Does she know how to be quiet?" he asked, addressing Sophie directly for the first time. Sophie lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a confidence that surprised. Even Sarah. "I do, sir, but may I ask a question?" Richard arched an eyebrow, amused by the girl's audacity. "You may." "What book is that?" Sophie pointed to the manuscript. "It looks very old." A cruel smile formed on Richard's lips. Here was the perfect opportunity for another of his demonstrations of intellectual superiority. "That is no ordinary book. It is a 15th century manuscript written in several ancient languages, something far beyond a child's understanding." "Which languages?" Sophie's question was asked with such simplicity that it sounded almost innocent. Sarah gently pulled her daughter's arm. "Sophie, don't bother Mr. Sterling with questions." But Richard raised his hand, signaling Sarah to stop. His eyes glinted with a particular malice. "No, let her ask. It's interesting to see youthful curiosity in action." He rolled his chair closer to Sophie. "Why do you want to know about the languages?" "Because I like languages," Sophie replied naturally. "I think it's interesting how people speak differently but want to say similar things." The laugh that came from Richard's throat was harsh and condescending. "Oh, you like languages? And how many languages do you know?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, looking at her mother, who shook her head discreetly, as if trying to dissuade her from answering. But there was something in Richard's mocking expression that sparked an unexpected determination in the girl. 11, she said. The silence that followed was interrupted only by the muffled sound of traffic 40 stories below. Richard looked at Sophie as if she had just claimed she knew how to fly. The laughter that echoed through the office was so loud it made Sarah shrink even further. Richard leaned forward in his chair, clutching his stomach as if he had just heard the most hilarious joke of his life. 11 languages, he repeated between laughs, wiping a tear that had formed in the corner of his eye. "Sarah, your daughter has a very fertile imagination. Perhaps you should consider drama classes instead of wasting time with this fantasy." Sophie didn't move, didn't smile, and didn't show any embarrassment. She simply stood there, observing Richard with the same curiosity she had shown toward the manuscript. Sarah, on the other hand, felt her face burning with shame. "Sophie, stop this." "Apologize to Mr. Sterling," Sarah whispered, gently pulling her daughter's arm. "But Mum, I didn't lie," Sophie replied calmly. "I really do know 11 languages." Richard dried his tears and composed himself, deciding to take advantage of the situation for one of his favorite displays of intellectual superiority. It was the perfect opportunity to teach a lesson about lies and pretension to a child who clearly didn't know her place in the world. "All right then, little liar," he said, directing his chair toward the bookshelf. "Let's do a test. If you really know 11 languages, you should be able to understand when I speak to you in each of them." Sarah felt her stomach churn. She knew this cruel side of Richard well, the way he humiliated employees in meetings, how he found pleasure in exposing others' limitations. Now her daughter would be the next victim. "Mr. Sterling, please, she's just a child." "Don't worry, Sarah. It will be educational." Richard smiled coldly and turned to Sophie. "Let's start easy. Hello, little girl. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Sophie tilted her head slightly. "Yes, sir. You're asking if I understand English, and I do. But your pronunciation has a slight New England accent when you say little." Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected her to. "I notice such subtle details." He quickly recovered and switched to another language. "Très bien. Maintenant, pouvez-vous me dire comment vous avez appris le français?" "J'ai appris avec Madame Beaumont, une dame française qui vit dans notre quartier. Elle me donne des leçons gratuites le samedi matin." Sophie replied fluently. "Elle dit que j'ai une bonne prononciation." Richard's expression began to change. There was something in the girl's fluency, in the naturalness with which she spoke. That couldn't be faked. He had known French for 20 years and knew how to distinguish between someone who had memorized a few phrases and someone who truly mastered the language. "很好，你会说中文吗?" he asked in Mandarin, increasing the difficulty. "会的，先生." 我跟陈老师学中文，他在我们社区的图书馆教课, Sophie replied without hesitation, and then translated into English. Yes, sir. I learned Chinese with Mr. Chen. He teaches classes at our community library. Sarah looked at her daughter, as if seeing her for the first time. She knew Sophie was smart and spent a lot of time at the library, but she had never imagined her daughter had developed such advanced skills. Richard felt a strange chill run down his spine. He had spent 2 years trying to find someone who could at least identify some of the languages in the manuscript, and now a 12-year-old girl was demonstrating a linguistic mastery that rivaled his own. «Давайте попробуем русский», he said in Russian, his voice slightly less confident. «Конечно, сэр, русский язык очень красивый. Я изучаю его с помощью приложения и с помощью господина Соколова, который работает в пекарне рядом с нашим домом», Sophie replied, and then explained. «Of course, sir. Russian is very beautiful. I study with an app and with Mr. Sokolov, who works at the bakery near our house». The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was no longer the silence of scorn, but the silence of astonishment. Richard looked at Sophie with a new intensity, as if trying to decipher an enigma. «How," he began, but stopped, recomposing himself. «How does a child your age learn so many languages?» Sophie shrugged naturally. «It's not hard when you like it. I started with English at school. Then my mom took me to the library, and I discovered there were many books in other languages. The librarian, Mrs. Gable, introduced me to several people who came from other countries and live in our neighborhood. They like to teach because they miss home. And the apps," Sarah added, still processing everything she was discovering about her daughter. «She's on her phone all the time. I thought it was just games." «Some are games," Sophie admitted. «But games that teach languages are more fun than normal games." Richard moved closer, his curiosity now genuine. «What other languages do you know?" «Italian, German, Arabic, Japanese, Latin, and—" Sophie hesitated for a moment. «Ancient Hebrew." «Ancient Hebrew," Richard's voice came out almost as a whisper. «The rabbi at the synagogue near our house teaches me. He says it's important to know ancient languages to understand how modern ones developed." Richard looked at the manuscript on his desk, then back at Sophie. An impossible idea began to form in his mind. For 2 years, several experts had examined that document. Renowned linguists, university professors, certified translators, all had managed to identify only fragments, isolated languages, pieces of meaning that never connected into a coherent whole. «Sophie," he said, and for the first time his voice carried no condescension. «Would you like to take a look at that manuscript?" Sarah stepped forward, alarmed. «Mr. Sterling, she can't touch anything. She won't touch." «Dad, only look." Richard rolled his chair to the glass table. «Come here, Sophie." Sophie approached slowly, her eyes fixed on the ancient parchment. As she got closer, her expression changed. What was once casual curiosity transformed into intense fascination. "This is incredible," she murmured, leaning over the table without touching the manuscript. "It's like a linguistic puzzle." "What do you mean?" "Look here." Sophie pointed to a section without touching the paper. "This part is in Latin, but it uses ancient Greek grammatical structure. And here—" She moved her finger to another area. "This looks like Arabic, but with some characters that are more like Hebrew." Richard felt his heart race. In 2 minutes of observation, this girl had identified patterns he had never noticed, even after 2 years of studying the document. "Continue," he said, his voice tense with expectation. "It's as if whoever wrote this wanted only someone who knew many languages to be able to understand the full message. Each language tells a part of the story, but they are all connected." Sophie looked up at Richard. "Can I try to read some parts?" Richard nodded, unable to speak. Sophie began to read in a low voice, translating as she went. "True wisdom does not reside in the accumulation of wealth, but in the understanding that all men are—" She stopped abruptly, frowning. "What is it?" Richard asked. "This word here—" Sophie pointed to a specific symbol. "I can't identify the language. It looks familiar, but—" Several experts tried to decipher that part. No one could. Sophie continued studying the manuscript in silence for a few minutes. Richard and Sarah watched, mesmerized, as the girl's eyes moved across the parchment as if she were reading a common book. "Mr. Sterling," Sophie said finally, looking up with a strange expression, "who said this manuscript is from the 15th century? The question caught Richard by surprise. The experts who authenticated it. Why? Sophie bit her lower lip, hesitant. "It's just that some of these symbols and linguistic structures I'm seeing here were only documented much later than that." The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of Richard's phone. He answered automatically, but his eyes remained fixed on Sophie. "Mr. Sterling, this is the authentication lab. We have some results on the manuscript you sent us for additional analysis. There's something you need to know urgently." Richard gripped the phone tightly, feeling his hands sweat. "What did you find?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady while watching Sophie, who continued to study the manuscript with increasing intensity. "Mr. Sterling, the carbon dating results are inconsistent with our previous analysis. The parchment really is from the 15th century, but the ink—" The technician's voice hesitated. "The ink contains components that were only synthesized in the 18th century. It's impossible, but the data doesn't lie." "What do you mean impossible?" Richard pushed his chair away from the table, creating space between him and Sophie, as if she could hear the phone conversation. Someone would have had to write on an authentic 15th century parchment using inks that didn't exist at the time, but there are no signs of overlapping or alteration. It's as if the ink and the parchment are the same age, even though that's scientifically impossible. Sarah watched Richard's expression change from confusion to something close to panic. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could tell something was deeply wrong. "There's something else," the technician continued. "We found traces of a pigment that matches a secret formula used by only 3 known artists in history. All of them lived in different periods, separated by centuries. Are you sure of the results? We repeated the tests 3 times, sir, and there's something even stranger. We submitted small samples of the text to a computational linguistic analysis algorithm. The program detected writing patterns that suggest multiple authors, but with a level of coordination impossible for the time." Richard hung up the phone slowly, the technician's words echoing in his mind. For 2 years he had boasted of possessing that manuscript, using it as a symbol of his cultural and intellectual superiority. Now he discovered that he didn't even know what he truly owned. "Mr. Sterling," Sophie's soft voice brought him back to the present. "Are you okay?" He looked at her, this child who in a few minutes had noticed inconsistencies that renowned experts failed to detect in 2 years. "Sophie, you said some symbols here shouldn't exist in the 15th century. How can you be so sure?" Sophie pointed to a specific section of the manuscript. "This symbol here, for example. It's a variation of an Arabic character that was only documented after Al-Jahiz's studies were translated into Latin in the 16th century, and this Greek grammatical structure," she moved her finger to another area, "only appeared in texts after the discovery of certain Byzantine manuscripts in the 17th century. "Did you study the history of linguistics?" Richard asked, incredulous. "Not exactly studied, but when you learn many languages, you end up learning about how they changed over time. It's like—" Sophie paused, searching for the right words. "It's like studying the evolution of a family. You learn when certain traits appeared." Sarah listened to everything in silence, feeling a mixture of pride and concern growing in her chest. She had always known Sophie was special, but she was beginning to realize she might not fully understand just how extraordinary her daughter really was. Richard rolled his chair closer to the manuscript, studying it with new eyes. "Sophie, would you be able to translate more parts of the text? I can try, but—" Sophie hesitated, looking at her mother. "Some parts are very complex. It's not just about knowing the languages. It's about understanding the historical context, cultural references, philosophical nuances." "Do you understand philosophy?" Sophie blushed slightly. "I read some books at the library, Dr. Thorne, who is a retired philosophy professor, sometimes talks to me about the texts. Thorne? Richard frowned. Dr. Julian Thorne, Sarah explained. He's an English professor who lives in our neighborhood. He teaches Sophie about literature and philosophy on Thursday afternoons. Richard felt a pang of something he couldn't identify. Envy? Respect? For decades he had accumulated degrees, hired the best tutors, attended the most prestigious universities. And there was a 12-year-old child who had built her own network of mentors in a community library in a working-class neighborhood. "Sophie," he said slowly, "would you like a challenge?" Sarah stepped forward, alert. "Mr. Sterling, what are you thinking?" If Sophie could translate a significant percentage of this manuscript, say 80%, I would establish a scholarship program for talented children from low-income families. The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah looked at her daughter, then at Richard, trying to process the proposal. Sophie, for her part, studied the businessman's face with the same intensity she had studied the manuscript. "What kind of program?" Sophie asked. "Full scholarships for high-level private schools? Access to specialized tutors, study material?" Richard paused, savoring the feeling of power the proposal gave him. "But only if you can prove you can do what you claim. And if I can't? Then you will learn a valuable lesson about not promising things beyond your capabilities." Sarah felt her blood boil. She had known Richard for years and knew he was using her daughter as entertainment, setting her up for public humiliation. "Mr. Sterling, my daughter is not an experiment." "It's not an experiment, Sarah. It's an opportunity." Richard turned back to Sophie. "Well, do you accept the challenge?" Sophie looked at the manuscript, then at her mother, and finally back at Richard. "I accept, but I have conditions." The audacity of the response surprised even Sarah. Richard arched an eyebrow, amused. "Conditions? A 12-year-old child is imposing conditions on me?" "If you want me to do serious work, I need proper resources," Sophie said calmly. "Internet access for research, high-quality copies of the manuscript so I can study it without damaging the original, and access to specialized reference materials. And what else? The scholarship program can't just be considered. It has to be actually implemented if I fulfill my part of the deal." Richard studied the girl's determined face. There was something in those brown eyes that bothered and fascinated him at the same time. It was as if she could see through his intentions, as if she understood the game he was playing and decided to play by her own rules. "All right," he said finally. "You'll have all that. But I choose the deadline. 3 weeks." "3 weeks?" Sarah exclaimed. "She has school homework." 1 month, Sophie countered, "and I can come here every afternoon after school to work." "Every afternoon?" Sarah looked at her daughter with concern. "Sophie, that's a lot." "Mom, I can do this." The confidence in Sophie's voice was absolute. Richard extended his hand. "We have a deal." Sophie looked at the outstretched hand for a long moment. Then, with a maturity that contrasted strangely with her age, she shook the businessman's hand. "We have a deal," she confirmed. At that moment, none of them, not Richard, not Sarah, not Sophie, could have predicted the consequences of that handshake. The manuscript resting on the glass table held secrets that went beyond its mysterious origin. And Sophie, with her brilliant mind and unwavering determination, was about to discover truths that would change not only her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. Sarah looked out the panoramic window, watching the city stretch to the horizon. She had the strange feeling that her daughter had just taken a step into a world she was not a part of, and for the first time in a long while, she felt afraid. Richard, for his part, watched Sophie with a complex mix of feelings. There was something about that child that challenged everything he believed he knew about intelligence, social class, and human potential. And while part of him waited anxiously to see if she really could decipher the manuscript, another part began to fear what she might discover. The phone rang again. This time, it was his assistant. "Mr. Sterling? Dr. Finch from Oxford University is on the line. He says he has urgent information about the medieval manuscript you own. Something about a discovery that could completely change our understanding of the document." Richard hesitated before answering the call from Oxford. The day had been a succession of disconcerting surprises, and he was beginning to question everything he believed he knew about the manuscript he prized so much. With a sharp movement, he picked up the phone. "Dr. Finch. Mr. Sterling, good afternoon. I'm sorry to bother you, but an extraordinary situation has arisen." The British academic's voice sounded tense across the international line. "We received an inquiry from a collector in Vienna about a manuscript practically identical to yours. The photographs they sent us are disturbing." "Identical how?" Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "Not just similar, Mr. Sterling. Identical. Same parchment, same ink, same content. Even the age spots are in the same places." Finch paused. "The problem is that this manuscript has been documented in Vienna since 1847. It has a full provenance, detailed historical records." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Richard's heavy breathing. Sophie and Sarah watched his expression change from confusion to something close to despair. "What are you trying to say?" Richard asked, though he already suspected the answer. "I'm saying there is at least one forged manuscript, Mr. Sterling, and considering the one in Vienna has solid historical documentation." Finch left the implication hanging in the air. Richard hung up the phone with excessive force, making Sarah jump slightly. 2 years. 2 years of showing that manuscript to important visitors, using it as a symbol of his cultural refinement, and now he discovered he was likely the owner. Darby sophisticated forgery. "Mr. Sterling?" Sophie approached cautiously. "Did something happen?" He looked at her with an expression that mixed anger and humiliation. "It seems my manuscript might be a fake. Do you want me to stop analyzing it?" "No." The answer came out harsher than he intended. "I want you to continue. If it's a forgery, I want to know exactly how it was made and who had the audacity to deceive me." Sarah noticed the shift in Richard's tone. The curious fascination of the previous minutes had turned into something darker. "Mr. Sterling, maybe it's better to leave this to the experts." "The experts were incompetent," he snapped coldly. "A 12-year-old girl noticed inconsistencies they didn't see in 2 years." Sophie felt the weight of Richard's expectation and frustration fall on her shoulders. But instead of backing away, she moved closer to the manuscript. "If it's a forgery," she said slowly, "it's a very strange forgery." "Why?" "Because whoever made this knew more about linguistic history than they should have. It's not just a copy. It's as if someone created a document that tells a specific story through the evolution of language." Sophie frowned, concentrating. "It's almost like it's a code." "A code?" "Yes. Every temporal inconsistency I find seems intentional, as if the irregularities are part of the message." Richard moved closer, his interest renewed despite the humiliation. "What kind of message?" Sophie studied the manuscript for a few more minutes in silence. Sarah watched her daughter work, noting the intensity with which she concentrated, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. "Can I take some notes?" Sophie asked. "I need to map the linguistic patterns to understand the sequence." Richard nodded and provided paper and pens. For the next hour, Sophie worked methodically, copying symbols, making diagrams and connections that neither Richard nor Sarah could understand. The afternoon was darkening when she finally looked up. "I found something," she said, her voice heavy with excitement and apprehension. "What?" "The temporal inconsistencies follow a pattern. Each error corresponds to a specific historical period where there were great social changes or revolutions in human thought." Sophie pointed to her notes. "The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, abolitionist movements. So what? It's as if whoever wrote this was trying to tell the story of the evolution of human consciousness regarding equality and social justice." Sophie looked directly at Richard. "And the main message isn't very comfortable for someone in your position." The brutal honesty of the observation hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. "Explain." Sophie hesitated, looking at her mother as if asking permission to continue. Sarah nodded subtly. "The text talks about how true power corrupts people, making them believe their wealth and position make them superior to others. But it also talks about redemption, about how even the most lost people can find their way back to humanity. "You're over-interpreting," Richard said coldly. "Maybe. But there's a section here," Sophie pointed to a specific area, "that talks about a powerful man who loses everything he believes defines his value, his mobility, his status, his certainties, and only then manages to see the truth about himself." Sarah felt the air become heavy. She knew Richard's story, knew about the accident that had left him in a wheelchair 5 years ago. Seeing her daughter inadvertently refer to that trauma made her tremble with anxiety. Richard remained silent for a long moment, processing Sophie's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with a dangerous coldness. "Interesting theory. But you forget something important." "Sophie? What?" "You need me. Your family needs me." He rolled his chair closer to her, his presence suddenly intimidating. "I can make your life much better or much worse, depending on how you behave." Sarah stepped forward, instinctively protecting her daughter. "Mr. Sterling, Sophie is only doing the work you asked for." "The work I asked for was translation, not psychoanalysis." Richard didn't take his eyes off Sophie. "Do you want to continue with our deal? Then focus on the facts, not on sentimental interpretations." Sophie held his gaze without flinching. "Fine. But the facts are these. The manuscript is real, but it's not from the 15th century. It's much more recent, probably from the 19th century, and whoever wrote it knew it would be discovered by someone specific." "Specific how?" "Someone wealthy, powerful, arrogant, and who collects rare objects as status symbols." Sophie paused, letting the words weigh in the air. "The entire document is a trap." The revelation fell over the office like a bomb. Richard looked at the manuscript, then at Sophie, slowly processing the implications of what she had said. A trap for what? To force that person to confront truths about themselves that they would rather ignore. Sophie stood up, putting away her notes. "Whoever wrote this didn't want to sell an ancient manuscript. They wanted to send a message." "And you think that message was for me?" "I don't know. But someone spent a lot of time and effort creating something that could only be deciphered by a specific mind, in very specific circumstances." Sophie looked around the luxurious office, then back at Richard. "And here we are." At that moment, the phone rang again. Richard answered impatiently, but his expression quickly changed as he listened to the voice on the other end. "Mr. Sterling, this is Anthony from the Municipal Archives. You asked us to investigate the provenance of the manuscript you bought 2 years ago." The man's voice sounded nervous. "We found something very strange in the auction records. The seller used fake documents. In fact, that person doesn't even exist." Richard felt the world spin around him. "What do you mean they don't exist?" "The name, the address, the auction house, all fake. It's as if someone created a complete identity just to sell this specific manuscript to you." Anthony paused. "There's one more thing. We managed to trace the money from the transaction. It was deposited into an account that was immediately closed, and the funds were transferred to a charitable foundation that works with education in underprivileged communities." The phone slipped from Richard's hand, falling to the floor with a dull thud. Sophie and Sarah watched, shocked, as he tried to process the information. Someone had elaborately orchestrated for him to buy that manuscript. Someone had studied his habits, his interests, his psychology, and had created a perfect trap that would only be activated when the right person, a child with extraordinary linguistic skills, appeared to decipher it. "Mr. Sterling?" Sophie approached cautiously. "There's one more thing I need to tell you about the manuscript." He looked up at her, fearing yet another revelation. "I found a hidden dedication. It's written in an ink that only becomes visible under a certain angle of light." Sophie pointed to a section that seemed blank. "And it mentions your name." Sophie's words echoed in the office like a final sentence. Richard felt his hands tremble as he looked at the seemingly blank section of the manuscript. For 2 years, he had looked at that empty area dozens of times, never imagining it. contained a hidden message directed specifically at him. "Show me," he said, his voice hoarse. Sophie picked up the manuscript delicately and positioned it near the window, adjusting the angle until the late afternoon light hit the parchment in a specific way. Gradually, like magic, words began to appear on the seemingly virgin surface. "For Richard Sterling," Sophie read slowly, "he who lost his humanity when he lost the ability to walk among equals." Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, horrified by the cruelty of the message. Richard, for his part, turned as pale as the paper. The reference to the accident that had left him in a wheelchair was unequivocal and impossible to ignore. "Continue," he whispered. "If these words have reached your eyes, it is because you have finally found someone capable of seeing beyond the barriers you yourself built. The child who translates these lines is no accident. She is your mirror. She shows what you could have been if you had chosen humility instead of arrogance." Sophie stopped reading, looking at Richard with a mixture of compassion and concern. "Mr. Sterling, maybe I shouldn't continue." "Continue," he ordered, his voice laden with a dangerous intensity. "You became a prisoner not of your chair but of your own bitterness. You built an empire of glass and steel to hide from the world, but forgot that glass walls allow everyone to see the darkness you carry inside." Sophie hesitated again. "There's more, but read it all." Sarah moved closer to her daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. She could feel the tension radiating from Richard like heat waves. Sophie took a deep breath before continuing. "This girl who translates my words grew up in poverty, but flourished in wisdom. You grew up in abundance, but withered. In emotional ignorance, she learned languages to connect with the world. You learned them to separate yourself from it. She sees equality where you see hierarchy. She sees opportunity where you see threat." "Who wrote this?" The question came out as a roar. "Who had the audacity to study me, to judge me, to create this entire elaborate farce?" Sophie continued reading, ignoring the explosion. "If you are wondering who I am, the answer is closer than you imagine. I am someone who watched your transformation closely, who saw how you became a prisoner of your own pain, and decided to convert it into cruelty." Richard ran his hands over his face, trying to process the enormity of the situation. Someone close to him had orchestrated this entire elaborate lesson in humility. Someone who knew intimate details of his life, his personality, his weaknesses. "There's more," Sophie said softly. "I don't want to hear any more." "But it's important," she insisted. "The last part is different." Despite himself, Richard nodded for her to continue. "But this is not a message of condemnation, Richard. It is a message of hope. The child who reads these words did not come to expose your flaws, but to show your lost potential. If you can see in her not a threat to your status, but an opportunity for redemption, perhaps you can still find the man you used to be." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of distant traffic. Richard stared fixedly at the manuscript, as if he could find answers between the lines. "Who else has access to my office?" he asked finally, addressing Sarah. "Sir?" Sarah seemed confused by the question. "Who else works on this floor? Who could have studied my routine, my habits, my personality?" Sarah thought. For a moment. "Well, there's the cleaning crew, the security guards, your personal assistant, the maintenance staff." "Names?" he demanded. "I want names." "Mr. Sterling," Sophie interrupted softly, "maybe the person's identity isn't the most important thing right now." "How is it not important?" Richard turned to her, his eyes flashing with anger. "Someone made a fool of me, humiliated me, created an elaborate farce at my expense, and you think it's not important to find out who it was?" "It's just that—" Sophie hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The person who wrote this clearly cares about what happens to you. It wasn't done out of cruelty, it was done out of love." "Love?" Richard laughed bitterly. "You call this love?" "My grandmother always says that sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who have the courage to tell us truths we don't want to hear," Sophie explained. "Whoever did this spent a lot of time, money and effort to create something that could reach you in a way that simple words couldn't." Sarah watched her daughter speak with a maturity that constantly surprised her. At 12, Sophie demonstrated an understanding of human nature that many adults never developed. Besides, Sophie continued, there's something else in the manuscript, a part that talks about the future, not the past. What kind of future? It talks about a program, an initiative you could create, not just scholarships, but something bigger. A system that identifies children like me in underprivileged communities and gives them access not just to formal education, but to mentors, resources, real opportunities. Richard frowned. How can there be something about a future program in a manuscript that was supposedly written in the last century? Because, Sophie said slowly, I think whoever wrote this knows you very well, knows your capabilities, your connections, your potential to make a difference, and believed you would do the right thing if you were properly motivated. Motivated or manipulated? Is there a difference? The question caught Richard off guard. For 5 years since the accident, he had focused exclusively on exercising control over others, on demonstrating power through manipulation and intimidation. The idea of being manipulated himself, and for an apparently noble purpose, was simultaneously humiliating and disturbing. Mr. Sterling, Sarah said hesitantly, maybe we should go. It's been a very long day and— No, Richard raised his hand. Sophie, you said, you can translate 80% of the manuscript. I want you to do that, but not in 3 weeks or a month. I want it in 1 week. 1 week? Sarah protested. That's impossible. She has school. She needs to sleep. She can come here every morning before school and every afternoon after. I will provide everything she needs, equipment, materials, even tutors if necessary. Richard looked directly at Sophie. But I want to know everything. Every word, every implication, every hidden message in this document. Sophie studied his face, seeing something she hadn't noticed before. Beneath the anger and humiliation, there was a genuine curiosity, almost desperate, as if he needed to understand not just the manuscript but himself. All right, she said, but I need one thing besides the materials. What? I need you to tell me about the accident. The request hit Richard like an electric shock. Why on earth do you need to know about that? Because there are references in the manuscript that only make sense if I understand your personal context. It doesn't have to be now, but at some point during this week I need to know what really happened to you. Richard remained silent for a long moment, struggling with the idea of exposing his vulnerability to a 12-year-old child. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. Tomorrow, he said. Come tomorrow morning, and we'll begin. When Sarah and Sophie finally left the office, Richard was left alone with the manuscript. Slowly, he rolled his chair to the window and looked at the city stretching below him. For 5 years, he had felt like a god watching from his throne of glass and steel. Now, for the first time, he felt small. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his assistant. Mr. Sterling, there's a woman down here who insists on speaking with you. She says it's about the manuscript and that you'll want to hear what she has to say. Name? Eleanor Vance. She's a retired teacher and says she knows the identity of the person who created the manuscript. Richard felt his heart race. Send her up. While waiting for the elevator to arrive, Richard looked once more at the manuscript. At that moment, he realized there was one more section of hidden text that had not yet been revealed. And this time, the words that appeared under the light made him question everything. He thought he knew about his own life. The accident was not just an accident, Richard, and you've always known that. Eleanor Vance was about 60 years old, with grey hair pulled back in an impeccable bun and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of many secrets. When she entered Richard's office, her presence filled the room in a way few could. There was something in her posture that suggested intellectual authority, but also a profound sadness. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice carrying an accent that mixed several origins. Thank you for seeing me. Richard studied her carefully. There was something familiar in her face, but he couldn't identify what. You said you know the person who created the manuscript. I do. Very well, in fact. Eleanor approached the table where the document rested, her eyes filling with tears. Because I was the one who created it. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard looked at her with an expression that mixed shock and growing fury. You? Me. Eleanor delicately touched the edge of the manuscript. I spent 3 years preparing this project, studying you, understanding your patterns, your psychology, waiting for the right person to decipher it. Why? The question came out as a roar. Why on earth would you do something like that? Eleanor sighed deeply before answering. Because you were my son, Richard, and I watched as you turned into a stranger. The world seemed to stop. Richard looked at Eleanor with wide eyes, slowly processing the words he had just heard. That's impossible. My mother has been dead for 15 years. Eleanor Vance is not my real name. It's the name I adopted when I faked my own departure. She moved closer, and Richard could see similarities in the shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw. My real name is Eleanor Sterling. No. Richard shook his head violently. No, this is a farce. My mother died in a car accident. I was at the funeral. You were at the funeral of a woman who died in an accident, yes, but it wasn't me. I needed to disappear, Richard. I needed to leave your life so you could find your own path. Eleanor pulled up a chair and sat in front of him. But when I heard about your accident 5 years ago, when I saw how you reacted, how you closed yourself, off to the world, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. Richard felt as if the floor was disintegrating beneath him. For 15 years, he had carried the guilt for his mother's supposed death. He had used that pain to justify his growing bitterness. You let me think you were dead for 15 years? His voice trembled with a mixture of pain and anger. I was dying, Richard. Not physically, but emotionally. Watching you become colder, more calculating, more cruel to those around you. Eleanor wiped a tear. You weren't like that as a child. You were kind, curious, concerned for others. And you thought faking your own death would be the solution? I thought that without my constant presence, you would be forced to find your own humanity. But instead, you became worse. Eleanor looked around the luxurious office. You built this empire of solitude and used your power to hurt others. Richard ran his hands over his face, trying to process the enormity of the revelation. And the manuscript? Why create this elaborate farce? Because direct words never worked with you. You were always stubborn. You needed to discover things on your own to really believe in them. Eleanor smiled sadly. Remember as a child how you loved puzzles. You always said the best truths were the ones you had to work to find. That doesn't justify what you did. No, it doesn't justify it. But when I heard you had become even more bitter after the accident, when I discovered how you treated your employees, how you had completely lost the capacity for empathy, I knew I had to do something drastic. Richard felt a wave of nausea. And Sophie? Did you orchestrate her meeting me too? Not exactly. I knew Sarah. I knew she had an extraordinary daughter. But I didn't plan for them to come today. That was destiny, perhaps, or luck. Eleanor looked at the manuscript. But when I heard that a child had deciphered in one afternoon what experts couldn't in 2 years, I knew it was time to reveal myself. How do you know Sarah? Eleanor hesitated for a moment. She took care of me for a while, a few years ago, when I was going through difficulties. She is an extraordinary woman with an even more extraordinary daughter. Richard remembered Sophie's words about the accident not really being an accident. The manuscript said my accident wasn't accidental. What does that mean? Eleanor's face hardened. It means I discovered things about that day that you never knew, about why you were on that specific road, at that specific time. Explain. Do you remember why you were driving to the Miller farm that Sunday? Richard frowned. There was an issue with the lease contract. I needed to resolve it personally. There was no issue, Richard. Someone forged documents to make you believe you needed to go there urgently. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window. I spent 2 years investigating, hired. Private investigators tracked every call, every document. Who would do something like that? Mark Vance. The name hit Richard like a bolt of lightning. Mark had been his closest partner at the time, someone he trusted completely. Mark? But why? Because you had discovered he was embezzling funds from the company. The day before the accident, You said you were going to confront him on Monday. Eleanor turned to face her son. He couldn't let that happen. Richard felt the world spin around him. For 5 years he had blamed fate, bad luck, his own recklessness for the accident that changed his life. He had never imagined it could have been deliberately orchestrated. How did you find all this out? After I heard about the accident, I began to suspect. Mark took control of the company very quickly, made changes that benefited only him. So I hired professional help. Eleanor sat back down. I have all the proof, Richard. Documents, recordings, evidence enough to destroy Mark completely. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because you weren't ready to hear it. You were consumed by anger, by bitterness. If you had known the truth back then, you would have used that information to become even more cruel, more vengeful. Eleanor held her son's hands. I needed you to find your humanity first, before giving you the weapons to destroy another human being. Richard pulled his hands away, still processing the betrayal. And now? Now that I know the truth? Now the choice is yours. You can use this information to destroy Mark. You can seek revenge. You can let this fuel your darkness even more. Eleanor paused. Or you can use this truth to finally free yourself from the past. Free myself how? By forgiving. The word fell between them like a stone in still water. Richard looked at his mother as if she had suggested something physically impossible. Forgive? The man destroyed my life. Your life is only destroyed if you allow it to be. Eleanor stood up again. Richard, you're a billionaire. You have a successful company, unlimited resources, influence that could change thousands of lives. Your wheelchair didn't change any of that. It changed everything. It changed only your perspective. And maybe that wasn't completely bad. Eleanor pointed to the manuscript. Before the accident, you were becoming exactly like Mark, greedy, corrupt, willing to step over anyone to get what you wanted. The accident forced you to stop, to reconsider. It forced me to become bitter and cruel. That was your choice, not an inevitable consequence. Eleanor headed for the door. I'll let you process all this, but tomorrow, when Sophie comes to translate the rest of the manuscript, she will find something that will change your perspective on choices and consequences. What else is in the manuscript? The story of a man who had a second chance to do things differently, and what he chose to do with that opportunity. Eleanor stopped at the door. Sophie, is that? Second chance, Richard, don't waste it. After she left, Richard was alone in the office that suddenly seemed smaller, less imposing. He looked at the manuscript and saw no longer a symbol of his sophistication, but a cruel mirror reflecting all his flaws. His phone rang. It was Sarah. Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry to bother you, but Sophie is very worried. She said she felt like something terrible was going to happen when we left today. Is everything okay? Richard looked out the window at the lit city below. Sarah, I need to ask you something. Did you ever take care of a woman named Eleanor Vance? The silence on the other end was too long to be casual. Sarah? Mr. Sterling, Yes, I took care of her, but how do you... She was here today. Said she knows Sophie. Oh, no. Sarah's voice came out as a terrified whisper. Mr. Sterling, I can explain. I didn't know... When she told me who she really was, I promised never to say anything. Who she really is, Sarah? Your mother, sir. Eleanor is your mother. The confirmation, though expected, hit Richard with renewed force. How long have you known? 3 years. She showed up at the hospital where I was working as a caregiver. Very sick, very sad. She said she had made the biggest mistake of her life and needed to find a way to fix it. Sarah paused. Mr. Sterling, she never stopped loving you. Everything she did was out of love. Richard hung up the phone and was left alone with his thoughts. Outside, the city continued its nightly dance of lights and movement. But inside the office, time seemed to have stopped. He looked again at the manuscript and noticed more text appearing under the night. Light coming through the windows, words that weren't there before, as if the document were revealing its secrets gradually. The true measure of a man is not what he does when he has power, but what he does when he discovers his power was built on lies. Richard spent a sleepless night, the revelations about Eleanor and the accident spinning in his mind. When Sarah and Sophie arrived in the morning, they found him still wearing the clothes from the day before, with deep, dark circles under his eyes. "Sarah," he said in a hoarse voice, "you knew Sophie would be able to decipher the manuscript, didn't you?" Sarah lowered her eyes. "Eleanor asked me to keep an eye out for opportunities. When the school cancelled classes yesterday, it felt like destiny was conspiring." "Eleanor wanted you to discover the truth on your own," Sophie explained. Sarah didn't know the details. Sophie approached the manuscript. "Now that I know the truth, I understand why the text seems so personal to me. Eleanor researched far beyond your personality. There are references in the manuscript to a child of languages born of humility. Did she know about you from the beginning?" "Not specifically about me, but she knew that children like me exist in underprivileged communities, and she bet that one of those children would enter your life." Sophie began to translate the final sections of the manuscript. Here it talks about Mark Vance. He's dying of pancreatic cancer. He has a 15-year-old daughter who knows nothing about what her father did. Richard felt the weight of moral complexity. Exposing Mark would mean destroying an innocent teenager. "Eleanor wants you to have all the information before you decide," Sophie continued reading. "The question is not whether you have the right to revenge. The question is what kind of man you choose to be." Sarah handed over a letter from Eleanor. "Richard, if you decide to confront Mark, I will support you. If you decide to forgive him, I will also support you. I love you, son. I always have." "The scholarship program," Richard said finally. "We're going to implement it, not as a deal, but because it's right. And Mark? I'm going to visit him, to make peace with the past." Sophie smiled for the first time. How can a 12-year-old have more wisdom than a 45-year-old man? Maybe because I haven't learned yet that I'm supposed to be afraid of being kind. His phone rang. It was his assistant. "Mr. Sterling, Mark Vance is on the line. He says he needs to speak urgently about something that happened 5 years ago." Richard hesitated before answering. For 5 years he had fantasized about this moment, but now, knowing the truth about Mark, everything was different. "Put the call through," he said finally. The voice that came through the phone was unrecognizable, weak and broken. "Richard? Thank you for answering. I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors say I have a few months." "I'm sorry." "No, you're not, and you shouldn't be." Mark took a labored pause. "Richard, I need to tell you something about the accident. I caused that accident. It was my fault." Even expecting it, hearing the confession hit Richard devastatingly. "You had discovered I was embezzling funds. When you said you wanted to review the contracts, I knew I was finished." Mark began to cry. "I forged a problem at the Miller farm to buy time, and you let me drive there knowing the road conditions." "Yes, and not a day goes by that I don't hate myself for it," Mark sobbed. "My daughter Lily visits me every day. She looks at me with so much love. I need you to know I'm sorry." Richard looked at the manuscript, remembering the words about forgiveness. "Mark, where are you?" "St. Jude's Medical Center, room 412. I'm coming to see you." At the hospital, Richard found Mark skeletal in bed, next to a teenager holding his hand. "Dad, you have a visitor," Lily said cheerfully. "You must be one of Dad's friends." Mark opened his eyes, seeing Richard with terror and relief. "Lily, this is Richard Sterling." Lily stood up enthusiastically. "Dad talks about you sometimes." After she left to get coffee, the two men were alone. "Richard, I didn't expect you'd actually come." "Neither did I." Richard moved closer. "Mark, how long have you been suffering with this?" "Since the moment I heard you were hurt. I tried to convince myself it was an accident, but I knew the truth." "And after? Why did you never say anything?" "Cowardice." Mark turned to face Richard. "And when I saw how you changed, I convinced myself that telling you would only make everything worse." "Mark," Richard reached out his hand. "I forgive you." Mark's tears were like a dam breaking. "Thank you, thank you. The accident changed my life, yes. But the choices I made after were mine. You are responsible for the accident. I am responsible for who I became." Richard stayed at the hospital for 2 hours talking with Mark and Lily. When he said goodbye, there was peace in his chest. As he left, his phone rang. It was Sophie. "Mr. Sterling, how was the conversation?" "Unexpected. Sophie, tomorrow we officially start the scholarship program, and you're going to help me design it. And first I need to make a call." "To whom?" "To my mother." But when he got home, Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, he heard a message. "Richard, if you're hearing this, you chose the path of compassion. I'm proud. But now I need to tell you one last truth that will change everything. Come meet me tomorrow at the place where we used to feed the ducks. There's something you need to see." Richard looked at the manuscript and noticed a final section Sophie hadn't mentioned, and the words he read made his world shake. "Sophie is not just a talented child who appeared by chance. In your life, Richard, she is your sister." Richard couldn't process the words. He reread them 3 times, hoping they would make sense. "Sophie is your sister." It was impossible. Sophie was 12, he was 45. The next morning, he met Eleanor at the park where they used to feed ducks. "You need to explain about Sophie," Eleanor sighed. "Sophie is my daughter, Richard, your sister on my side." "How?" "After I faked my death, I was lost for years. I met a man, got pregnant, but he abandoned me. Sarah was going through her own tragedy. She had lost a baby. When we met, she offered to help. And Sarah. We decided to raise Sophie together. Sarah would be the legal mother, but I would help. Sophie was special from birth. There was an extraordinary intelligence. How long did you plan to hide this?" "Forever, initially. But when Sophie began to demonstrate such advanced skills, I realized she could be the key to reaching you." "You used my own sister to manipulate me." "No. I created opportunities. What happened after was genuine." "Does Sarah know Sophie is my sister?" "No. Sarah believes Sophie is the daughter of the man who abandoned me." "What truth?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "Sophie is the daughter of Robert Sterling, your father." "That's impossible. Dad died when I was 10. "Robert didn't die, Richard. He abandoned me." Eleanor trembled. "When you were 10, I discovered he had another family. When I confronted him, he said he was leaving us. You told me he had died." "Because it was easier for a child to believe their father had died than to know he had chosen to abandon them. But Robert never fully left. Years later, when I was desperate, he reappeared. And Sophie is the result of that reunion. Your sister on both mother and father's side. Where is he now?" "He died 2 years ago. He never knew about Sophie." "Does Sophie know anything?" "Nothing. And you need to decide what to do with that information." Richard's phone rang. It was Sarah in a panic. "Sophie has disappeared. She left early and left a note saying she needed to discover truths on her own." Richard felt his blood turn cold. "Sophie must be looking for evidence." "The documents," Eleanor said. "I have a box with all the original certificates at Safekeep Storage, Willow Street Unit, 27. They rushed to the storage facility and found the door open. Sophie was sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers, holding a birth certificate and a photo. When she saw them, she looked up with devastation and sadness. "Hello, brother," she said in a broken voice. "Or should I call you Mr. Sterling?" The silence in the storage unit was deafening. Sophie was surrounded by papers that told her true story. Richard and Eleanor stood at the entrance, paralyzed. "Sophie," Eleanor began, but the girl raised her hand. "Let me understand this first." Her voice was steady. Sophie held up the certificate. "Mother, Eleanor Sterling. Father, Robert Sterling. The same names from the family manuscript you dropped in the office." She held a photo. "This shows Robert, Eleanor, and a boy who is clearly you as a child. The resemblance between us is undeniable." Eleanor knelt. "Sweetheart, I know you must be confused and hurt." "Confused, yes. Hurt." Sophie considered. "Yes, but not in the way you imagine." "What do you mean?" Richard approached. "I'm hurt because you thought I wasn't strong enough to handle the truth, Because while I was helping you find out who you really are, you were hiding who I really am. Sophie, we only wanted to protect you, Eleanor said. Protect me from what? From knowing I have a brother who can give me opportunities? From discovering that my biological mother sacrificed herself to give me a better life? Sophie stood up. Or protect me from knowing that Sarah loved me unconditionally for 12 years? Sophie's perspective surprised them. They expected anger and devastation. They found mature acceptance. Family isn't just about blood. Sarah raised me, loved me. Eleanor gave me life, and Richard. Richard showed me that people can change. Sophie smiled. I didn't lose anything. I gained more family. Sophie, I'm so sorry for all this, Richard said with tears. You didn't know I existed until a few days ago, and when you found out, you changed your life completely. Sophie held his hand. That's not something to apologize for. Now we need to figure out how to move forward. First, we tell Sarah everything. Second, we implement the scholarship program, not just for you to make peace with the past, but because there are hundreds of children like me who need opportunities. And third, Eleanor asked, third, we're going to be a family. A strange, complicated one, but a real family. 2 hours later, they were gathered in Sarah's apartment. The conversation was difficult, but something beautiful emerged. Sarah hugged Eleanor. Thank you for letting me be her mother when I needed it most. Eleanor held Sarah's hands. Thank you for loving my daughter better than I ever could. Now let's talk about the scholarship program, Sophie said. They planned together the Lily Sophie Foundation, named in honor of the 2 girls who showed Richard the power of youth. The program would offer mentorship, family support, and a supportive community. I want Sarah to be the director, Sophie said. She understands how to support children who need opportunities. You raised Sophie. That's the only qualification that matters, Richard agreed. 6 months later, the foundation had become a reality. 50 children were selected, each paired with another for mutual teaching of languages and cultures. Sophie continued living with Sarah, but spent weekends with Richard. Eleanor had officially resurrected and worked as an educational coordinator. Mark Vance had passed away in peace. Lily, the foundation's first beneficiary, was studying at an international school and ran an inspiring blog. The manuscript was donated to the National Library, becoming a case study in reconciliation and healing narrative. On a September afternoon, Sophie appeared in Richard's office. Brother, can I ask a question? Always. Do you regret it, losing 12 years of my life? I don't regret it, Sophie. If things had been different, I might not have become who I needed to be your brother. And you might not have had Sarah as a mother. So you believe everything happened for a reason? I believe that sometimes life breaks us so we can learn to reconnect in more beautiful ways. Richard smiled. And that the best stories are where people find each other when they need it most. Sophie turned to the window. You know what else I learned? That forgiveness isn't forgetting what happened. It's choosing to write a different ending to the story. Richard stood beside his sister, watching the city. Sophie, thank you. For what? For saving me from myself. For showing me it's never too late to be who you should have been. Sophie held her brother's hand. It was my pleasure, brother. And for the first time, Richard felt truly at home, not in the luxurious office, but in the presence of the people he had learned to love more than himself. The story that began with isolation and bitterness ended with connection and hope. 50 talented children were discovering that their dreams had no limits because an extraordinary girl had found the way to her lost brother's heart. The manuscript fulfilled its purpose, reuniting a fragmented family and creating a new, much larger family. Richard understood that true wealth is not measured in money, but in the depth of the human connections we choose to cultivate. The journey from a bitter man to a loving brother was complete, but the story they would write together would be even more beautiful. The end, dear listeners. We hope the story of Richard, Sophie, and Eleanor has touched your heart. If you were moved by Sophie's wisdom in transforming her brother's life and Eleanor's courage in orchestrating this family reconnection, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you most in this story. Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, showing that true wealth lies in the bonds we build, the ability to forgive, and the generosity of using our resources to transform other lives. We wait for you in the next episode, with another narrative that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on the values that truly matter in life.